Hi everybody, I'm Associate Professor Alex Russel from the Experimental Gambling Research Laboratory at Seeker University, Australia. I've been asked to give you a little talk on gambling in Australia. I'm just going to show you some of the basics, some of our most recent work on this too. That'll hopefully talk you through, what gambling looks like in Australia, how maybe it compares to the rest of the world, and maybe some of the newer things that we're looking at in gambling research here too. So just a little bit about our research group to start off with. This is the Experimental Gambling Research Lab. Up the back here we've got Professor Matthew Rockloff, who's the head of the lab. Professor Nerily Hing here. A lot of what I'll be talking about today is work that she's led. And Professor Matthew Brown over here. There's me, a few of our PhD students and research assistants here as well. And some previous members in here too. So this is us. We like what we do. We're doing some pretty good work, and it's a pleasure to present our team's work for you. Right, so we recently completed a study looking at what's happening in terms of gambling in Australia. Now these figures are pre-COVID. COVID has changed a few bits and pieces, but we haven't really seen any reliable sort of COVID figures come out. A few different studies are showing a few different things, so it's a little bit hard to get a picture of exactly what's happened during COVID, but regardless, it's going to be pretty similar to what we've seen here now that things are settling down, venues are opening up again. So what we typically have seen in Australia is that gambling participation is dropping. Maybe 10 years ago, about 2/3 of Australians would bet at some point in the last 12 months. That's now down to about 56%. So, and it's dropping. Every prevalent study that we see in all the different states and also national, this is national by the way, we are seeing lower figures coming out. So, fewer people being involved in gambling. Online betting though is taking off. So betting on your computers or your smartphones has approximately doubled in the last 10 years, the proportion of people who are doing it anyway, and that's because we've always got phones with us. I'll talk a little bit in a sec about what online gambling looks like compared to gambling in venues, or via telephone calls potentially too. So most people are still just betting in venues. And people who bet online here, they can also bet in venues too. So this is figures for people who have bet online, whether or not they also go to like the pub or the casino or whatever to place a bet. About a little over 1% are what we classify as problem gamblers. We try not to use that term these days. It's not particularly PC because it kind of blames the person for having a problem and doesn't necessarily recognise like the environment around them. The sheer amount of advertising. I'll talk about that in a sec. Or the fact that gambling companies offer all these amazing inducements to get you to bet there too. It's pretty hard sometimes to stay away from it, particularly if it's something that you find very attractive. So we try not to use the words problem gamblers, but you'll still see it in the literature because it is sort of a recognised term on the scale that we tend to use. But beyond that, there are also some people who are sort of not quite, at that problem level, but are on their way there. And we call these either low risk or moderate risk gamblers. And there's about a further 9.7% of those in the population. So, about 11% of Australian adults are experiencing some degree of problems with their gambling there. All right, so let's have a look at what we bet on. Now, this is comparing two national prevalence studies. The blue bars here are what was happening in 2010-11, around there, and the orange ones are what's happening in the most recent study, 2019. And you can see that pretty much all of the orange bars are lower than their equivalent blue bars. So the most prevalent form that we do here on the left is lotteries. Most people buy lottery tickets at some point. There might be a jackpot going on or something. Still a lot of people buying lottery tickets. Lotteries are generally seen as pretty benign. They don't really usually cause much in the way of problems. And a large reason for that is because you can't just sit there at the newsagent and buy a lottery ticket and then the lottery is drawn and then buy another lottery ticket and keep buying tickets and finding out whether you've won continuously. You buy your ticket and you wait a while to find out if you've won or not. But what you can do is you could sit there at the newsagent and buy a scratch ticket, or a scratchy, or a scratch it, or an instant scratch card. Different states call them different things. But instant scratch tickets here, you can do that. You could buy a ticket, scratch it off, see if you've won, hand it over the counter, and buy another one and keep doing that. But people don't tend to do that too often. Scratchies here have dropped by about half, almost exactly half actually. Everything else is on the decline too. So, fewer people are betting on races, on EGMs. These are pokies or slot machines. Pokies are dropping too. Sports betting, all these things, we're seeing fewer and fewer people doing them. But we are seeing some new forms of gambling coming through that really didn't exist about 10 years ago. So things like, betting on what we call novelty events. So like elections, for example, or who's going to win a reality TV show, or those sorts of things, is becoming more and more common, and was actually a pretty big thing during COVID, the initial lockdowns in early 2020, when no sport was around. So, a few people are doing this. We're also seeing things like betting on esports, which are professional video games. That's becoming quite a big market. At the moment it's pretty small, but people are interested in it, and I'll talk more about some of these new products as we go. There'll be a little bit more on this later in the talk. All right, so let's talk about what it looks like when you go to a venue and gamble. Now, most people don't think of lotteries and instant scratch tickets as a gambling activity. You sort of recognize that it is. You're putting money at risk to see if you're going to win more money. But, when people think of the word gambling, they tend to think of the more intense kind of forms. So not necessarily buying a lottery ticket, although we classify it as gambling for things like prevalence studies, but more things like maybe playing bingo. Well, that seems pretty benign too, but same sort of thing. You go in, you buy your bingo cards, and you might win a prize or some cash or something out of it. Bingo is a form of gambling. Now we're talking in most people's minds though, going to like the TAB to place a bet on, a race or the sports or something like that. There are these TAB venues everywhere. It's pretty hard to go somewhere and not see them basically. They exist just pretty much solely for going in there and placing a bet. They don't have things like pokies in them or anything. It's just a place where you can go and place a bet on sports or on races. Now, not a lot of people go to these because you can do a lot of that online, and I'll come to online gambling in a second. The main form of gambling that we all think of is pokies, and pokies are pretty much far and away, the worst form of gambling in terms of the effects that it can have on people. Some people can certainly lose their houses in terms of things like sports betting and race betting. Doesn't seem to happen very often with things like bingo or lotteries, but pokies are really the big one that cause a lot of problems in our society. So they're everywhere. We're kind of unusual in Australia that we have pokies in our pubs and clubs. So we have casinos, and most countries have casinos, and you can go, or at least an area where they allow casinos. And you can go and play pokies or slot machines or fruit machines. Different countries call them different things. But there aren't many countries in the world that have pokies in their pubs and clubs. And Australia is actually really quite unusual about that. Something like 3/4 of the pokies in the world that aren't in like casinos or gambling specific venues, but are in pubs and clubs, 3/4 of those are in Australia. That gives you an idea of just how unusual we are with that. So it's the fact that pubs and clubs aren't set up necessarily as gambling venues. You go there and you have a drink without necessarily, feeling like you have to gamble. And the gambling just happens to be there. So that's a bit unusual. Clubs often, and pubs will often have TAB facilities in there too. So, there's a little counter where you can go and place your bets too, and sometimes a wall of TVs where you can watch the races or the sports maybe. And a lot of them have Keno too. Clubs in particular have Keno, which is basically a very fast form of lottery, where there's always a draw happening. So I said before, you don't stand in a casino, in a newsagent I should say, buy your lottery ticket and wait there until it's drawn. But with Keno you can, because there's a new round every few minutes. So, a lot of these venues really only exist because gambling is there. If they didn't have pokies in pubs and clubs, quite a few of them wouldn't be around. They're required essentially to keep them viable. And for a lot of people that's a bit of a concern because that's built on losses, right? All of this money that goes into pokies and comes out, for the people who own the venues and the pokey machines and government taxes and everything, is based on people losing money. Now, Australians are actually the biggest losers in the world. We lose more per capita than people in any other country by quite a way. So this is us up the top line here. This is in US dollars, and we lose on average about $1,000 US per head per year. Now keep in mind that, remember, almost half the population doesn't gamble. So amongst those who do gamble, they're losing on average $2,000 a year. And a lot of those people will only bet on, say, the Melbourne Cup or something. So a lot of people are losing a lot more than $2,000 per year. And that's the concern around gambling, is that all of the money that comes out of this is losses, and usually amounts that people can't afford to lose. So when we have a look at this top bar as well, what it's also done is split out the figures by gambling product. So this, lower part of the line here, this sort of, teal or whatever colour that is here, the first part of the bar there, that's pokies, right? Have a look at how much we lose on the pokies compared to all the other countries. And really, we lose more on the pokies than most other countries lose on gambling, full stop, all things combined. So then on top of that, we've got casino games, and then we get into betting, which is, sports and race betting sort of thing. Lotteries we lose a bit of money on, and online here too. So online, though, I'm going to talk about that in one sec. So the big thing here is that we do have a lot of gaming machines, and they're all over the place. Except in WA. Western Australia doesn't have pokies in their pubs and clubs, and we've got a paper hopefully coming soon on what that means in terms of gambling problems. Online gambling, though, in Australia is a lot more restricted compared to other countries. Now, this sort of surprises people. We have a big gambling culture in Australia. It goes back to, like the goldfields and everything. We are a nation of gamblers, as you can see, not just from the losses, but also because, we do have things like the Melbourne Cup, the race that stops a nation, and we do have, lotteries that have funded things like the Sydney Opera House and the Sydney Harbour Bridge. A lot of the funding from that came from lotteries. So gambling is a really big part of our culture. We see gambling ads everywhere. I'll talk about those too. But in online gambling, we're actually a lot more restricted than other countries. So we only allow some things online. We only allow betting on races and sports. We call this wagering. And other things as well. Other means, like those novelty events, kind of things like, betting on elections or betting on the weather or, stuff that's not sports or races. We do allow buying lottery tickets online, but not instant scratchies. So we don't have instant scratchies online, but you can buy your lottery tickets online. And just recently, online Keno has come in. So that was specifically banned for quite a while. And now that's been allowed in certain circumstances. So, that's a little bit of a concern, because when you have a look at the things that are allowed online, they're all the kind of forms of gambling where you place a bet and you usually have to wait a while until you've found out whether you've won or lost. So you bet on sports, for example, and you have to wait, a few hours for the game to be over to find out if your team won. Of course, you can bet on things in the game too, and I'll talk about that. But we've set things up so that you have to wait a while, usually, when you bet online to find out whether you've won or not. We don't have online casinos, so you can't go and play, roulette or blackjack or whatever online for money, or at least you shouldn't be able to. There will certainly be overseas websites that will take your money if you do play with them. And we don't have online pokey machines as well. Again, you talk to a lot of Australians and they don't even know these things exist, but overseas, they have online casinos, they have online pokie machines in them. Part of the reason we don't have it is because people in venues, like the staff there at a pub or a club, can make sure you're okay. And pubs and clubs usually close, so there's a time where you have to stop. But if you're betting at home online, you can just keep going, right? So that's part of the reason those aren't allowed. We also don't have online poker either, and that upsets a few people. But again, it's that kind of thing where you can sit there and play hand after hand after hand, and no one's really keeping an eye on you. The other thing we don't have is live betting. So by live betting, I mean betting on something, say in a sports match, once the match has started. If we want to bet on, say, an AFL match, we can bet on who's going to win the match overall, or who's going to win the first half or whatever. But let's say you've placed a bet on who's going to win overall, and you see your team gets off to a really bad start, and it looks like actually they're probably not going to lose. You could do what we call a live bet. So once the game is live, you could actually go, I'm going to try and win some of that money back, or go and bet on the other team now. You can't do that online. You actually have to make a phone call to the people that you have an account with. So let's say you've got an account with TAB or Sportsbet or whatever, and you've placed your online bet with them before the match started. You would now have to call them and say, well, I want to place a live bet now on this game that started. And that telephone call is about, again, sort of checking in with someone, and just sort of delaying that really fast-paced gambling that live betting can bring. So overseas, they do have live betting. You can place an online bet once a game has started. So let's talk about online gambling. We do have the ability to bet on sports and races and everything. We don't have these casino games. And when you look at overseas that do have things like online casinos and online slots, they do tend to have a lot more online gambling going on because, people get access to more online, and we don't have that. So if you want to play these things, you have to go to a venue to do it. Things like roulette and, poker for money typically don't exist in pubs and clubs because they take up a lot of floor space. So you usually have to go to casinos for that. Most states in Australia have 1 or 2 casinos. A couple of states have a couple more. But you have to travel to do those. So that's why we don't see a huge uptake on those sorts of betting products. Sports and races, though, they do have a higher uptake of people using them compared to a lot of these casino type games because they're readily available. Now it's also worth pointing out here that a lot of people don't just gamble on one thing, right? Particularly people who are experiencing problems. They might go to the pub and play the pokies for a while, and then closing time comes around and it's like, well, I'll go home and place a couple of bets before I go to sleep. Wake up, see how they went. So, we don't really talk about just people who play the pokies and people who bet on sports because often there's a lot of overlap between these groups, and it makes it sometimes quite difficult to work out, what's going on in terms of which products are problematic and which aren't. But we still have a pretty good picture that pokies are a massive problem. All right. One of the other things with online that we've noticed over the last 10 years is that online bookmakers have changed. Typically in Australia, we like the idea of a fair go, so operators who will offer their odds, and if they lose, they lost, and that's it, new one, and that's okay. We've now seen that a lot of online operators have been bought out by particularly UK-based operators, and they operate on a very different kind of manner here. If you lose, they're quite happy to keep having you come back, and they'll offer you promotions and bonus bets and things like that to get you spending more with them. But if you have some wins, they'll cut you off. They'll say, that's it, we're not going to allow you to bet anymore, or you can bet, but you can only bet $1 a bet, and that's it. We're not going to allow you to do anything more than that. And a lot of Australians really don't like that because it doesn't fit with that fair go philosophy. It feels like the house is even more stacked against you. Now, of course, gambling is always stacked against you. The odds are set in such a way that, the operator should get a return, or their house odds, or the house edge, or that sort of thing. But just be aware that, this is even more stacked against you now in that they'll cut you off if you're winning too much too. So, a lot of people just sort of feel that gambling is getting a bit more dishonest or a bit more on the nose because of these sorts of changes. And of course, at the moment, 2022, when this is recorded, we're finding all about the casinos too, you know, Crown Casino and the Star. Yeah, it's not looking very good, is it? All right, let's talk about wagering ads as well, because that's one of the other big things with online betting is there's a ton of wagering ads around. How many are there? Well, there's a study here by Professor Kerry O'Brien and Dr. Muhammad Iqbal, published via the Victorian Responsible Gambling Foundation. I would suggest that you have a look at the Victorian Responsible Gambling Foundation's website. They've got a lot of great reports, a lot of great resources in terms of you know, information about gambling and gambling research too. They fund a lot of our studies as well. So this one was looking at gambling advertising back in 2016 because that's the data that were available. There'd been a change to wagering advertising legislation in 2015, so they wanted to see if the gambling operators were doing what they were meant to be doing. And they found that there were 136,918 ads on free-to-air TV during 2016. Now, that seems like a lot, but is it? Well, it's sort of hard to get an idea just from that number alone, because there's, you know, a few free-to-air channels. There's, you know, 7 and 9 and 10, and then they've all got their own like satellite channels as well. You know, it's not just Channel 7 anymore, it's Channel 7 and 7 and 8, and, you know, those will differ in different markets, of course. But you get the idea that there's a lot of, you know, channels around. But what if I told you it was 5 times as many ads as alcohol? Now, we see a lot of alcohol advertising on TV, and there's 5 times as many gambling ads as alcohol. That starts to put it into perspective, right? Lots of ads. And most of these ads are happening during daytime hours when kids are watching TV. Now, they're not allowed to advertise in kid-specific programs, so anything that's rated like G, for example, you won't see gambling ads in there. But you will see them in the news and current affairs, and you'll see them around sporting matches too. Not always though. A lot of the gambling advertising happens around, you know, outside of sporting TV programs, so like, you know, a match, for example. And that sort of worries people a little bit there too. So it seems like kids are receiving a lot of exposure. Since this study, or before the study was published actually, but, you know, sort of as a result of what was coming out of this, some changes were made in terms of when advertising could happen around sporting matches too, because kids watch sport as well. So, you know, that's one of the concerns around the amount of advertising. And, you know, crackdowns are starting to happen. There's probably a bit more that could be done, potentially. I also want to talk to you about how the products themselves, like sport and sports betting, is changing, because this is something that we're really seeing over the last few years. Now, you'll also see here, sorry, in red, it refers to references. At the end, I'll have a link that you can type in and actually access a whole bunch of references that I talk about here, and some others too. All right, so I've talked about it with sports. You know, we used to place a bet, and then the match would start, and, you know, you usually bet on who was going to win. And a few hours later, or a few days later, or something like that, you'd find out whether your bet was, you know, correct or not, whether you'd won or lost. What we see though with the more dangerous types of gambling is that there isn't this long gap between when a bet's placed and the outcome. So look at something like a pokey. Every spin is a bet. So a bet's placed, and then a few seconds later you find out the outcome, and you can bet again straight away. And you can have, you know, hundreds of bets in an hour. Let's have a look at how that's changed though. Let's have a look at how, for example, sports betting is moving more to that continuous, potentially dangerous sort of model. So this is the old school type of betting, right? Think of this as a timeline. We've got when the match starts and when the match ends over here. And you used to place your bet before the match started, and you'd find out the outcome when the match finished, because you'd bet on who was going to win. So it's a pretty long gap between when the bet was placed and the outcome, right? Then we brought in betting not on the outcome of the match, but maybe on some other outcome in the game, like who was going to kick the first goal, or who was going to win the first half, or something along those lines. You know, whether a particular player was going to score. And now the gap is getting shorter, right? You know, you're still placing the bet before the match starts, but you're finding out, you know, you're betting on something that doesn't usually have to wait until the end of the game to find out if it happens or not. Now we've brought in live betting. You can bet after the match has started. Again, this is typically come in on betting on the final result of the match. That's at least how it started, and that's what a lot of the operators are looking to bring in. You know, potentially who won, how much they won by, that sort of thing, but still something that's at the end of the game. Combine those two though, and we've got live betting on an in-game event, and you can see that arrow between the boxes is getting pretty small now. All right. What about this new thing, which I'll show you a bit of my research on, betting on micro events. So this is betting on something that's just about to happen in the match. So an example of this is, say, in tennis, betting on who's going to win the very next point. So you only have to wait just a few seconds to find out if you've won or not. Now in Australia, you know, this isn't currently allowed, but there's a grey area between betting on micro events and the one above, live on in-game betting there, which is just how long that arrow is. So in micro events, the arrow's pretty small. I can barely fit it in there, right? But what typically happens is they don't just bet on one micro event. They'll bet on one and 1 point in tennis, and then the next point in tennis, and maybe the next point in tennis, and keep doing it over and over again. And that's what a pokey is, right? Just that continual kind of betting. So we're seeing, you know, moves to these lucrative kind of opportunities for sports betting in particular, because you extract more money from people, right? But there is a question, like, where do you draw the line? So I mentioned in Australia that betting on micro events here, or micro betting, isn't currently allowed. But in this game here, one operator was offering the ability to bet on an over in cricket, not the next ball in cricket, which would definitely be micro betting, but an over, which is only 6 balls, and that's only, you know, a few minutes long. So where is that line? That's the thing that's a bit difficult to legislate, really, and to ban it properly. Either way, micro betting is still available overseas, and so Australian punters shouldn't be able to bet overseas, but many do. It's not particularly hard to get around some of the restrictions. So let's have a look at who bets overseas. In this graph, the blue bars are people who don't micro bet, and you can see that they're pretty evenly, these are regular sports bettors, and you can see they're pretty evenly split over the risk groups. These are, you know, the gambling problems risk groups. So no problem, low risk, moderate risk, and problem. The blue bars are all about the same. But when we have a look at the people who do bet on micro events or micro bet, they're almost exclusively problem gamblers. Only 5% are non-problem. 78% of people who bet on this form of gambling are experiencing some form of problem. And there's also the people here, the low risk and moderate risk. These are people who are experiencing some problems from their gambling too. So really, 95% of the consumers on this product are experiencing some degree of problems. Now, and 78% being the big one, these are the ones who are experiencing the really intense problems. So I want that figure to jump out. I'm going to make it big and red, you know. I'm going to make it flash a bit, right? Because I really want you to see that, you know, by looking at the way that sports betting is changing here, we can see that we're moving more to products that are really designed to appeal to the people who have issues. And that's a lot of what we're looking at here and trying to, inform governments about so they can make decisions, for example. The other issue about micro betting is the ability to match fix. We're seeing, you know, more and more issues around corruption in sport. It's always been there, you know, but typically because people bet on who was going to win a match or not, you usually had to get people to throw an entire match, and that's hard to do, right? But here, all you have to do is get people to bowl a ball that's a no ball. So here in cricket, you've got to have your foot behind the line, like some part of your foot behind the line. And this is quite a big no ball. You don't normally see people overstepping by all this much, which suggests that it was pretty deliberate, and he actually got caught out for this too. And you know, you can bet on this, right? So you can bet on whether this ball was going to be a no ball. And if you've got a whole bunch of people who are in the know and have agreed to pay this guy to do this at this point, that's where corruption comes in. Now, this is easier than getting a whole team to throw a match, right? Just getting one guy to bowl one no ball. Your team can still win. You know, there's less of a concern around integrity in that respect, but you know, it's obviously a problem. So, you know, there's not a lot going for a lot of these new products that are coming out. Microbetting here seems to appeal almost exclusively to people who have problems, and probably ushers in new ways of corruption happening. I want to change now to a little bit of a talk about this generational shift we're seeing in terms of who bets on what, or who gambles on what, I should say. So I want to talk briefly about what the definition of gambling is and point out how some of these things are kind of blurring the lines a little bit. So something's a gambling product if you put something of value at risk, usually money, but it doesn't have to be. It could be, you can gamble with cigarettes, with food, whatever. What happens, in terms of determining that bet is at least in part determined by chance, and potentially you're going to win something of value here too. Again, doesn't have to be money, usually is, but doesn't have to be. Now, when we look at gambling products, right, so things like lotteries and pokies, looking at the top line of the table here, something of value goes in, money, you pay to gamble. There's a degree of chance involved in whether you win or lose. Some things certainly have some skill, like poker, but pokies are purely chance-based. And you can get something of value out too, so you're trying to win money. There are all these new things that are popping up, things like social casino games. So these are like apps on your phone or on Facebook or something like that, that look and feel like gambling. Like you're playing a pokey, for example, a slot machine, and you can pay. You don't have to, but you could pay to get extra credits in the game, so you can advance through levels more quickly, for example. But you can't actually win any money out of it. So these aren't technically classified as gambling, because you can't win anything, and that means that they're available to people who are under 18. Obviously, some concerns are about grooming. Loot boxes in video games. These are ways that you get things in video games. So you can play for a long time, and you might get this chest or a box that appears, and you can open it. You usually don't know what's in there until you open it. Most of the time, they have something that's not particularly useful. So like the way your weapon looks in the game or something like that. Sometimes you might get a really rare one, and that's potentially worth a little bit of money here too, particularly if you can sell them outside of the game. So we're seeing these things pop up around video games in particular. These gambling type mechanics are coming in. So you've got social casino games where you can't actually cash out whatever you win, but now you've got loot boxes where, at least in some games, you can sell some of the things that you get out of the loot boxes. And a few other forms here too. Betting on esports, that's just flat out gambling, just on esports instead. Skin gambling, fantasy sports, I'm not going to go into what they are, but the main point is that all of these seem to sort of have something to do or something in common with gambling, or at least are kind of blurring that line a little bit. What's a little bit tricky here though is you also maybe need to think about whether they look or feel like gambling too, because that's not always that obvious. And so something like loot boxes, sure, you understand there's a degree of chance in terms of whether you're winning something or not, but it doesn't necessarily look like gambling because it looks entirely different, right? Things like gambling, you think of cards and pokies and stuff like that, but not loot boxes. So that's part of the challenge. You go and talk about these things and everyone's like, but you're a gambling researcher, why are you looking at these? And it's because at least in some games, they do seem to meet gambling criteria. I want to show you a study that I did recently to look at a bit of a generational shift here. So if you recall back to like one of the very early slides where I talked about, some of those new forms of gambling, there's not a lot of uptake on them. The reason for this is because older people don't know anything about them. If you talk to someone, a bit older and ask them what a loot box is or what esports are and things, they wouldn't have a clue. They'd think you just misspelled esports, for example. Think you just misspelled sports and wrote esports instead. But I'll show you a study that I wanted to have a look at where, this is one that I ran, where we had 18 to 24-year-olds, and then we had 25 to 29-year-olds. And the idea is that a lot of these newer forms haven't been around that long. So 25 to 29-year-olds, when they turned 18, because typically you turn 18, you go and have a drink, you go and have a bet, that sort of thing. When they turned 18, a lot of these things weren't necessarily around, versus, a younger crowd, 18 to 24. When we have a look, the greeny lines here on the left, this is the younger group, the 18 to 24-year-olds, and the blue lines are the 25 to 29-year-olds. When you look at what we call traditional forms, sports betting, lotteries, scratchies, pokies, that sort of stuff, the older crowd are more likely to do them. All right, so that sounds kind of good, right? Younger people aren't getting into gambling so much. I mean, there's another thing here which shows that they're more likely to do them while they're underage, this younger crowd. So maybe, you know, with increased access through online and stuff, you know, there's more access to some of these things, these forms, than the older crowd used to have when they were underage. Like, it's pretty hard to get into a venue to play a pokey when you're 16. It's not too hard to get on an online betting website. So they're trying it when they're young. It's just not necessarily translating through to sustained, you know, use of those things. But when we have a look at what we call these emerging forms, we see that the younger people are a bit more likely to take part in at least some of them anyway. And particularly things like loot boxes, esports, and playing video games, for example, that have a lot of gambling content in them. Younger people are far more likely to be taking part in these things. And the ones where we really notice a lot of differences, the big difference is that they're free, right? You can download a video game and play it for quite a while without having to pay for anything. They've moved to a format where they rely on people to buy loot boxes, for example, or at least some people to buy lots of loot boxes to sustain their business model. You used to just pay for a game up front once and that was all you ever paid. But these free versions of video games that you can play without putting a lot of money in, well, younger people don't have a lot of money, so this appeals to them and maybe gets them in and, you know, gets them interested. And once you know how it works, it's not hard to later translate into spending money. But the other point to note is that there aren't similar things here for traditional gambling, right? There are no free sports bets. You know, you usually still have to put money on to at least earn some free bets. You know, so there's no free entry into anything. You know, no one's going to let you play a pokey for free for a few spins, for example. So, you know, these new forms here that at least look and feel like gambling or have something very close to gambling going on, they're really blurring the lines in terms of gambling in Australia and worldwide, really. I won't worry about this slide. Main point is that, you know, younger people were also more likely to first take part in these emerging forms while they're under 18. The reason is pretty obvious. They're not restricted to those who are under 18, like pokies and things that are meant to be. But, you know, it sort of shows this changing, you know, generational shift in terms of what's happening. So we're seeing a move away from traditional gambling products now to these new products, particularly amongst younger people. It'd be really interesting to see what happens. And regulation is a bit slow in keeping on top of these because it's always a bit of a cat and mouse game. You know, you see what the products are when they come out. You try and determine whether you need to, you know, restrict them or anything, and then, you know, do some research as well to work that out. And by the time you get around to that, it's a couple of years down the track. The products are pretty well set in. So it's always really hard to keep on top of these sorts of things. I do have another upcoming study as well on this too, so keep an eye on the VRGF website and also my Twitter feed. I'll show you that in a sec. All of the references that I've talked about here can be downloaded at this link, and I think the slides are actually in there too. And I usually have all my papers on my website too, so you can go to this website and download stuff. If I can't because of, you know, things like copyright issues, then please just feel free to contact me. My contact details are on the website, or they're here. So, you know, here's my email address, that's my Twitter. Please feel very free to get in contact and ask any questions. I'm Alex Russel. Thanks for your time.